In this video, we'll carry on with our course on learning how to differentiate powers of x. Now, in the previous video, we saw that to differentiate a power of x, say f of x equals to x to the power of n, the power rule allows us to state that the derivative function f dash of x is equal to n times x to the power of n minus 1. And let's look at a quick example here. Let's say we had f of x equals to x to the power of 3, then the derivative function, which we call f dash of x, would be equal to 3 times x to the power of 2. Now, one thing we notice here is that in our previous video and in this example here, the power to which we're raising x is always a positive integer. But in fact, what we're about to learn is that this doesn't always have to be the case. And in fact, n can be, for example, a negative integer. So let's see how that works. Let's say we're given, and I'll just write example 1 here, let's say we're given f of x is equal to x to the power of negative 3, and that we're asked to differentiate this. Well, in this case, comparing this to the power rule, we can see that in this case, n is equal to negative 3. And luckily for us, the power rule still works, and we can go ahead and use it, and say that the derivative function, f dash of x, is equal to negative 3 times x to the power of negative 3 minus 1. Now, do be careful not to make a sign error here. Negative 3 minus 1 is negative 4. So this leads us directly to the final answer. F dash of x is equal to negative 3 times x to the power of negative 4. And there you go. We've just differentiated a negative power of x. Now, let's go a little further. An important thing to remember here, and I'll write this in blue to distinguish it from the rest, is that when we write 1 over x, we can write this as a power of x and say that this is x to the power of negative 1. In the same way, when we write 1 over x squared, we can also write this as a power of x and write this as x to the power of negative 2. And we can carry on this way. But a more generic way or a more general way of writing this is to say that 1 over x to the power of n is equal to x to the power of negative n. And the reason why we're seeing this is because this is going to open up a couple of doors here and allow us to differentiate some more complicated functions. For example, if we were asked to differentiate the following function, f of x is equal to 1 over x squared. Well, up until now, we really didn't know how to do this. But now, since 1 over x squared can be written as a power of x, namely, we can write f of x as f of x equals to x to the power of negative 2, this means that to differentiate this, we can use the power rule again. And we can go right ahead and say that f dash of x is equal to negative 2 times x to the power of negative 2 minus 1. And since negative 2 minus 1 is equal to negative 3, we can write our final answer and say that f dash of x, the derivative, is equal to negative 2 times x to the power of negative 3. And we're done. This would be a perfectly valid final answer. If we wanted to, though, and I'll just write this in blue to distinguish it, if we wanted to go a little further, since x to the power of negative 3, and I'll just write this here, x to the power of negative 3 is equal to 1 over x cubed, we could actually write our final answer as f dash of x is equal to negative 2 times 1 over x cubed, which is the same thing as negative 2 over x cubed. Important to note that both these answers are completely valid and will both be accepted in any exam. So it's probably safest to actually write your final answer in this format, just to avoid some silly mistakes that one makes at times. Now let's look at a couple more examples. Let's say we're given, and this would be example 3, let's say we're given f of x is equal to 1 over x. Well, in this case, we can use what we just learned and say that this is the same thing as writing f of x is equal to x to the power of negative 1. And so in this case, we can use the power rule and say that the derivative function, f dash of x, is equal to negative 1 times x to the power of negative 1 minus 1, which leads us to f dash of x is equal to negative 1 times x to the power of negative 2. And I'm going to go ahead and go one step further and say that this is f dash of x is equal to negative 1 times 1 over x squared, which leads us to the final answer, f dash of x is equal to negative 1 over x squared. And again, I'll insist, both this answer and this answer are typically correct and should be accepted as final answers in any exam. Let's look at one more example. So that would be example 4. Let's say we're asked to differentiate f of x is equal to 1 over x to the power of 5. Well, once again, we can see that this is the same thing as writing f of x is equal to x to the power of negative 5. And we can use the power rule to go ahead and write that the derivative function, f dash of x, is equal to negative 5 times x to the power of negative 5 minus 1. And since negative 5 minus 1 is equal to negative 6, this leads us to negative 5 times x to the power of negative 6. And finally, if we want to write this as a fraction, we could write this as f dash of x is equal to negative 5 over x to the power of 6. And there you have it. We've just learned how to differentiate negative powers of x using the power rule.